The city slept under a heavy, starless sky. Inside a nondescript sedan parked on a residential street, a man sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a house 3 doors down. He was tired, a deep weariness that settled into bones and blurred the edges of vision. He'd been here for 6 hours, watching the unremarkable home where a person of interest in a federal fraud case was supposed to be laying low. The lead had gone cold, like so many did. Nothing moved but a single porch light swinging gently in a faint breeze. He was an FBI captain, though you wouldn't know it to look at him tonight. His suit jacket was draped over the passenger seat. He wore a simple, dark polo shirt and a pair of clean khakis clothes meant for blending in, for not drawing attention during a long, boring stackout. His personal vehicle, a sensible sedan, was chosen for the same reason. It was anonymous. It was forgettable. Or so he thought. A soft chime from his phone signaled the end of the shift. His partner, a junior agent, had been relieved 2 hours prior. It was just him now, packing up the small digital recorder, the long-lens camera, his notebook. He started the car, the engine purring to life, and pulled away from the curb. The house remained dark, silent. Another night, another piece of a puzzle that refused to fit together. His mind was already transitioning, shifting gears from the hyper-focused world of surveillance to the mundane reality of the drive home. He thought about the leftover pasta in his fridge, the report he had to file by noon tomorrow, the deep, grateful sleep he hoped to find. His home was not in the city proper, but in a quieter tree-lined suburb, a 30-minute drive on a good night. Tonight was a good night. The roads were empty. The world was bathed in the orange glow of streetlights, and a light mist made the asphalt shimmer. He rolled down the window a crack, letting the cool air keep him alert. He knew this route by heart, every turn, every dip in the road. He was 5 minutes from his own driveway, from the end of another long day. He made the final turn onto Oak Crest Lane. It was a wide, peaceful street with large, set-back homes. He'd saved for years to buy here, for the good schools, the quiet. It was his sanctuary. As his car glided past the familiar mailboxes and manicured lawns, a new light flooded his mirrors, bright, urgent, in flashing blue and red. A police cruiser. It was close, right on his bumper. His first instinct, trained over 15 years in the Bureau and years in the Army before that, was one of calm assessment. He hadn't been speeding. His lights were on. Registration was current. He signaled smoothly and pulled to the right, coming to a complete stop at the edge of the road, the tires gently crunching on the gravel shoulder. He moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who understood procedure. He placed both hands on the top of the steering wheel, in clear view. He saw in his side mirror the 2 officers getting out of their car, one from the driver's side, one from the passenger. Their movements were sharp, efficient. He reached slowly, carefully, to the center console where his FBI credentials, his badge, and creds, as they called it, lay in a leather case next to his personal wallet. He'd learned long ago to always have them accessible. The approach was textbook, but the energy was all wrong. Instead of one officer approaching the driver's window, they split up. The driver came up on the left, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered pistol. The passenger officer circled wide, coming up on the right, flanking the car. The FBI captain kept his hands in sight. He turned his head slightly toward the left side window, which was still open a crack. The beam of a high-powered flashlight hit him square in the face. It was blinding, washing out his vision, turning the dark interior of his car into a stark white box. He squinted, turning his head away slightly. "Hands!" A voice barked from his left. It was taut, strained. "Let me see your hands." "My hands are on the wheel," the captain said, his voice level. He did not move. Step out of the vehicle. The same voice commanded. Now, do it slowly. This was escalating too fast. Something was off. He was being treated not as a motorist, but as a high-risk threat. The protocol was screaming in his head. Compliance and clarification. Okay, he said, his tone neutral, non-threatening. I am going to step out. I am a federal agent. My identification is in my hand. He moved with glacial slowness. With his left hand, he carefully lifted the leather credential case from the console. He then used his right to open the door latch. He pushed the door open slowly and began to swing his legs out, keeping the credential case held up, hoping the gold shield would catch the light. He never got the chance to say another word. I said, don't move. The voice roared. The flashlight beam jerked wildly from his right side. A shadow moved. The second officer had closed the distance. In one fluid, terrifying motion, the officer's arm came up, his service weapon drawn from its holster. The captain's world narrowed to a single, impossible point, the dark, round eye of the gun barrel, leveled directly at the center of his chest from a distance of about 6 feet. Time stopped. The cold night air vanished. The sound of crickets, the distant hum of a generator, the rough texture of the gravel under his shoes, it all melted away. There was only the gun and the tense, unreadable face of the young officer holding it. The officer's stance was braced, his finger indexed along the frame, just outside the trigger guard. But the intent was clear. The threat was absolute. 1,000 thoughts fired through the captain's mind, but they were not thoughts of fear, not yet. They were calculations. The distance, the angle, the officer's posture. Was he a hair trigger away from firing? The captain's own training screamed at him. Asterisk, do not make a sudden move. Do not give them a reason. Asterisk, he knew, with a chilling certainty, that in the eyes of these two men, he was not an FBI agent. He was not a neighbor. He was not a man coming home from work. He was a danger. A problem in a dark car in their neighborhood. His own identity, his whole life of service, meant nothing in this sliver of time. It had been erased, replaced by a single, damning assumption. He saw it in their rigid stances, in the way the first officer's hand hadn't left his own weapon, in the unwavering aim of the second. This was what it felt like. This was the precipice. He forced his breath to stay even. He kept his hands wide, the credential case dangling from his fingers. He slowly, so slowly, turned his head toward the officer with the gun. My credentials, he said, his voice surprisingly steady, a flat calm he did not feel. I am an FBI captain. I live on this street. I am reaching for nothing. The badge is in my hand. The officer with the gun didn't lower it. His eyes flicked for a millisecond to the leather case. Toss it on the ground, he ordered. Slowly, the captain bent his knees, lowering himself with extreme care, and placed the leather case on the gravel. He straightened back up, hands returning to the air. The first officer took a cautious step forward, kicked the case a few feet away, and then bent to pick it up, never taking his eyes off the captain. He flipped it open, shining his flashlight on the badge and the identification card inside. The beam of light moved from the plastic card to the captain's face and back again. There was a long, silent moment. The officer's posture changed, just a fraction. The rigid aggression bled into something else, confusion, then a dawning, ugly realization. He looked at his partner and gave a short, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The second officer's gun didn't waver. Step away from the vehicle, he said, though the command had lost some of its lethal edge. It was now just procedure, a script they had to see through. The captain complied, moving to stand near the rear of his car. The first officer finally approached, holding the open credential case out as if it were evidence of a crime. You should have announced yourself immediately, the officer said, his voice defensive, trying to reclaim control of a situation that had just spiraled far beyond a traffic stop. The captain said nothing. He just looked at the man, then at the other officer who was finally reholstering his weapon. The immediate danger had passed, but a new, colder feeling was flooding in to take its place. It was a mixture of profound relief and a sickening, hollow anger. The weapon was put away, but the accusation, the judgment, the sheer risk of his existence, still hung in the air between them, heavier than the night mist. They handed back his credentials. No apology was offered. There was no sorry for the mistake. Sir, there were only mumbled instructions about cooperating fully and standard procedure for a late-night stop in a high-value area. They took his driver's license, ran his plates, and stood by their cruiser in a hushed conversation while the computer in their car processed the information that would confirm what his badge had already told them. He was who he said he was. He was one of the good guys. When they returned his license and sent him on his way with a terse, "You're free to go," the captain got back into his car. His hands, he noticed, were now beginning to tremble slightly. He looked at his house, just a few hundred yards away. The light over his own porch was on, a warm, welcoming yellow circle. He sat there for a full minute before putting the car in drive. The familiar street no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a landscape full of unseen tripwires. He had walked the line between life and death on his own street, not in some far-off war zone or a dangerous raid, but because of what he looked like in the quiet dark. And as he pulled into his own drive, the shaking didn't stop until he was inside his own kitchen. The door locked behind him, the familiar hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. He stood there, leaning against the counter, and just breathed, in and out. The image of that gun barrel, steady and aimed right at his heart, played on a loop behind his eyes. He could still feel the ghost of that spotlight beam on his face. He looked down at his hands. They were the same hands that had signed arrest warrants, handled evidence, shaken the hands of grateful victims. Tonight, they had been told to stay in the air because they were considered dangerous. A hot wave of anger rose up in his chest, so sudden and powerful it made his vision swim. He slammed a fist down on the countertop, not hard enough to break anything, but enough to send a shock up his arm. The sound was sharp and loud in the quiet house. It wasn't just anger at the officers, though that was a big part of it. It was anger at the violation. His own street, his own home, the one place he was supposed to be able to let his guard down. They had taken that from him. For the next hour, he just moved. He made tea, but didn't drink it. He turned on the television, but didn't see it. His training kicked in, but in a cold, analytical way. He was an investigator. This was an incident. He needed to document it. He sat at his desk and opened a fresh notebook. In precise, clear handwriting, he wrote down everything. The time, the location, the weather, the exact words he could remember, the sequence of events, the flanking approach, the flashlight in the eyes, the command to step out, the drawing of the weapon. He described the officers as best he could, their approximate age, their posture, the tension in their voices. He drew a simple diagram of the positions of the cars. When he was done, he just stared at the page. The words looked so small, so inadequate to describe the sheer terror of those moments. But they were all he had. This was his testimony. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back on the gravel shoulder. He finally gave up around dawn, the sky turning a pale gray outside his window. He showered, dressed in a suit, his armor, and drove to the FBI field office. The world outside looked normal. People going to work, kids waiting for the school bus. But he felt separated from it by a thick pane of glass dot at the office, He went straight to the desk of a colleague he trusted, a man he'd worked with for nearly a decade. He closed the door and told him what happened, keeping his voice flat, sticking to the facts. His friend's face shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to a grim, familiar understanding. "You have to report it," his friend said. "Officially. To their department. And you need to tell the boss." That was the hard part. Walking into the section chief's office, sitting across from him, and recounting the story. The chief, a stern man with gray hair, listened without interruption, his fingers steepled. When the captain finished, the chief let out a long, slow breath. "That's a serious allegation," he said. "You know what it means to file a complaint against another law enforcement agency." The captain nodded. "I know, but I also know what I saw, what I felt. This wasn't a procedural mistake. This was something else." The chief studied him. He'd known this captain for years. He knew his record, his calm under pressure, his integrity. "All right," he said finally. "You have my support. File the complaint with their internal affairs. Do it by the book. We'll document it on our end as well. But—" he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Be ready. These things have a way of getting messy." That afternoon, the captain drove to the local police department's headquarters. It was a modern building of brick and glass, nothing like the old, intimidating precinct houses you see in movies. He felt a knot in his stomach as he walked in. He was used to being in police stations as a partner, a leader, someone with authority. Today, he was a complainant. The officer at the front desk was polite but cool. When he asked for the Internal Affairs Division, the officer's eyes flickered with a hint of surprise. He was directed to a waiting room on the 3rd floor. It was quiet, with worn chairs and outdated magazines. It felt like a doctor's office, but the illness was different. He waited for 40 minutes. Finally, a detective from Internal Affairs came out to get him. He was a tired-looking man in a rumpled suit, with a demeanor that was neither friendly nor hostile, just professionally detached. They sat in a small, plain interview room. The captain told his story again. He presented his FBI credentials and his driver's license. He handed over a copy of the detailed notes he had written. The detective took notes on a legal pad, his expression unreadable. He asked clarifying questions. "Did you verbally identify yourself as FBI before exiting the vehicle? Can you describe the exact position of Officer 1's hand on his holster? Are you sure the weapon was fully drawn and pointed, or could it have been held at a low-ready position?" The questions were fair, investigative. But the captain sensed a subtle undercurrent, a digging for inconsistencies, for any tiny crack that could be used to question his version of events. He answered patiently, precisely at the end. The detective closed his notebook. "We'll need to review the body camera footage," he said. "We'll be in touch." That phrase, body camera footage, gave the captain a small surge of hope. Of course, it would all be on video. The truth would be plain for anyone to see. The blinding light, the gun, the whole terrifying encounter. The footage would force an apology, maybe even disciplinary action. It would prove he wasn't crazy, that his anger was justified. He left the station feeling a little lighter. The system was in motion. He had done the right thing, but systems have a way of turning in unexpected directions. The call from the Internal Affairs detective came 3 days later. His voice was still neutral, but there was a new stiffness in it. "We've reviewed the footage and the officer's reports," the detective said. "We'd like you to come back in to give a follow-up statement." The captain's hope began to curdle. A follow-up statement? Why? Wasn't the video clear? When he returned to the same small room, the atmosphere had changed. The detective was there with another man, a lieutenant from the patrol division. The lieutenant didn't smile, didn't offer a handshake. He just nodded, his arms crossed. The detective started speaking. "We've completed our preliminary review. The body camera footage from the primary officer is partially obscured due to the positioning of the flashlight. However, the audio is clear." He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a copy of the incident report filed by the two officers. The captain picked it up and read it. His blood ran cold. The report described a high-risk traffic stop of a suspicious vehicle cruising slowly in a residential area known for recent break-ins. It stated that the driver was initially non-compliant, failed to immediately announce he was armed or a law enforcement officer, and made furtive movements toward the center console. It claimed the officers feared for their safety based on his agitated demeanor and evasive responses. The drawing of the weapon was described as a necessary and proportionate action given the totality of the circumstances. It was a masterpiece of defensive writing. It twisted every one of his careful, trained actions into something sinister. His slow movements were non-compliance. His attempt to show his badge was a furtive movement. His calm, steady voice was agitated. "This is not what happened," the captain said, his own voice tight. "The video. Let me see the video." The lieutenant spoke for the first time. "The footage is part of an ongoing internal investigation. It's not subject to release at this time." His tone was final. The detective continued, as if reading from a manual. "We have to consider the officer's perspective. It's late. It's dark. They see an unfamiliar car. They have a duty to protect themselves and the community." The captain listened, a hollow feeling opening up in his gut. He wasn't a victim here. In their telling, he was almost a perpetrator. He was the problem that justified their actions. The gun pointed at his chest was not an error. In their report, it was the logical result of his behavior. He left that meeting walking through quicksand. The official process, which he had believed in, was not searching for the truth. It was building a wall. The police union, he learned later, was already involved. The officers were being counseled, but also defended. A narrative was being spun in the back rooms and hallways of that brick and glass building. The oversensitive federal agent who didn't like being treated like everyone else. The captain drove back to his office, the familiar streets now feeling like hostile territory. He had filed a complaint seeking accountability. Instead, he had sparked a counterattack. They weren't just denying his story. They were rewriting it, painting him as the villain to protect their own. And he realized, with a sickening jolt, that his badge, his title, his years of service meant nothing in this fight. In fact, they might have just made him a bigger target. The days after the second meeting with Internal Affairs were strange and heavy. A silence descended. The official complaint he had filed seemed to vanish into a deep, dark hole. No one from the police department called. No updates, no requests for more information. It was as if he had shouted into a canyon, and the only reply was the echo of his own voice. Slowly fading, he tried to focus on his work at the FBI. There were cases to manage, reports to sign off on, meetings to attend. But his focus was shattered. In the middle of briefing his team on a financial crime network, his mind would flash to the glare of the flashlight. During a quiet moment at his desk, he'd find himself staring at his hands, remembering how they had trembled. The office, once a place of purpose, now felt like a stage where he was acting the part of a normal person. His colleagues knew something was wrong. They'd ask, "You all right?" And he'd give a tight smile and a nod. "Just tired." They didn't push. The law enforcement world understood walls. Then, 3 weeks after the traffic stop, the call came. It wasn't from Internal Affairs. It was from his own boss, the section chief. His voice was different. Not the supportive tone from before, but formal, almost cold. "I need you in my office now." A knot of ice formed in the captain's stomach. He walked down the long hallway, the sounds of typing and phones ringing sounding distant, like he was underwater. He entered the chief's office. 2 other men were there. One was from the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility, the Internal Affairs Unit for the Bureau itself. The other was a stern-faced man from the legal counsel's office. No one offered a handshake. No one smiled. "Close the door," the chief said. The captain sat. The air in the room was thick and still. The man from Professional Responsibility spoke first. He opened a plain manila folder. "We are here to inform you of a formal investigation," he said, his words clipped and precise. "A serious allegation has been made against you. It concerns your conduct in a prior investigation, the Henderson financial wire fraud case from approximately 22 months ago." The captain's mind reeled. The Henderson case? It was old, closed. A straightforward bust of a small-time money laundering operation. He had supervised it. It was clean. What allegation? He asked, his voice sounding strangely calm. The legal counsel answered. "A confidential informant from that case has provided a sworn statement. He claims that you solicited and accepted a bribe from him. He states that in exchange for $15,000 in cash, you agreed to alter his testimony to minimize his role in the scheme, which allowed him to receive a lighter sentence." For a moment, the captain was sure he had misheard. It was so absurd, so blatantly false, that it felt like a joke in terrible taste. A laugh, sharp and humorless, almost escaped his throat. "That's impossible," he said. "That informant was unreliable. We documented his credibility issues. His testimony was barely a factor in the plea deal. The prosecutors handled it. I never met with him alone. There are records, call logs." The man from Professional Responsibility held up a hand. "We are aware of your initial denials. This is a preliminary inquiry. However, given the gravity of the accusation, and the fact that it comes from a sworn source, we have no choice but to take immediate action." The section chief, looking at a spot on the wall behind the captain, delivered the next blow. "Effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave. You will surrender your service weapon, your credentials, your building access pass, and any government-owned equipment. You are not to contact any current informants, witnesses, or colleagues regarding any ongoing or past cases. You are not to discuss this internal matter with anyone. Do you understand?" The words hit him like physical blows. Administrative leave. Surrender your weapon. It was the ultimate disgrace for an agent. It was what happened to the dirty ones, the corrupt ones, the ones who betrayed the badge. He felt the eyes of the 3 men on him. They weren't looking at a 15-year veteran with a distinguished record. They were looking at a suspect. The walk from the chief's office to the security office to hand over his gear was the longest walk of his life. He felt every eye in the open-plan office on him. The whispers started before he even left the floor. He placed his Glock on the counter. The cold, familiar weight was gone. He handed over the leather credential case that held his badge and ID. The gold shield, the thing he had worked for his entire adult life, was taken from him and placed in a drawer. He emptied his pockets of his key cards. He was being erased right there in the sterile security office. They escorted him out of the building. He stood on the sidewalk in his suit, the sun shining brightly, people walking past him with their coffees, heading to work. He had nowhere to go. He couldn't go back inside. He was locked out. He drove home in a daze. The pieces were crashing together in his mind with a terrible logical clarity. The bogus complaint. The old, closed case. The unreliable informant suddenly singing a new, damning tune. The speed of it all. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a move. A ruthless, calculated counter-dash punch. His complaint against the two police officers had been a threat. He was a federal agent, a captain no less, saying they had broken the law, violated his rights. That kind of complaint could end careers, cost the city money, spark real change. It couldn't just be ignored. It had to be destroyed. And the best way to destroy accuser's credibility is to make him look like a criminal himself. He thought of the police union, known for its fierce protection of officers. He thought of the connections, the backroom deals. The informant must have been gotten to. Offered something a dropped charge elsewhere, money, protection. All to sign a piece of paper telling a fantastic lie. And his own bureau, bound by rules and procedures, had to treat the allegation as real. They had become an unwitting weapon in the hands of the very people he was trying to hold. Accountable. The next few days were a blur of stunned isolation. He called a lawyer, a former federal prosecutor he knew who now worked in private practice. The lawyer listened, and his first question was telling. "Who did you piss off recently?" He explained about the traffic stop, the complaint. The lawyer was quiet for a long moment. "Yeah," he sighed. "That'll do it. This is a classic discredit and destroy play. They're going to try to bury you." Friends from work called at first, offering awkward support. "I'm sure it'll get cleared up, man." But as the news trickled through the grapevine, a federal agent under investigation for bribery, the calls became less frequent. The law enforcement community is a small world. No one wants to stand too close to a sinking ship, even if they think it might be innocent. The stain of the accusation was spreading, and it was sticky. He spent his days in his own house, which now felt like a very comfortable prison. He read the news online, and then he saw it. A short article in the local metro section. The headline was vague, but devastating. FBI agent under investigation in corruption probe. The article didn't name him, but it gave enough details, his rank, his general division, that anyone in the know would figure it out. It mentioned the old Henderson case. It quoted an anonymous law enforcement source, saying the investigation was wide-ranging and serious. There was no mention of his complaint against the local police. Not a word. He knew then that the war was fully on. They weren't just fighting him internally. They were fighting him in the court of public opinion, shaping the narrative before he could even speak. They were making sure that if his story about the gun ever got out, people would read it and think, well, what do you expect from a corrupt agent trying to save his skin? He was trapped. The system he had sworn to uphold had been turned against him with a cruel efficiency. He was no longer a captain. He was a suspect, a pariah, a target. And he was standing alone in the crosshairs, unarmed, with his own badge used as evidence against him. The gun on the street had been holstered, but the one aimed at his life and career had just been fired. The waiting was its own kind of torture. The days bled into weeks, each one longer and emptier than the last. The captain's world, which had once been filled with the purpose of cases and the camaraderie of his team, shrank down to the four walls of his house and the slow, ticking clock. His lawyer was working, making calls, filing motions, but the legal machinery moved with a grinding slowness. Every phone call made his heart jump. Was it news? Was it over? It wasn't over. The knock came early on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't the soft tap of a neighbor or the firm rap of a delivery person. It was a heavy, authoritative pounding that shook the front door in its frame. He knew, even before he looked through the peephole. He saw them standing there on his porch, 3 of them. They wore suits, but they had the posture of men who were about to do something unpleasant. They were from the FBI, but not as colleagues. They were from the inspection division, the internal police of the Bureau, He opened the door. The lead agent, a man with a face like stone, held up a folded document. "We have a warrant for your arrest," he said, his voice devoid of any inflection. "You need to come with us." The words were like a physical impact. A warrant, arrest. They were making it real. They were going to put him in cuffs, in a cell, to stamp the accusation with the official seal of the justice system. "Can I at least put on shoes?" he asked, his voice surprisingly steady. He was wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt. The stone-faced agent gave a curt nod. "Make it quick." He walked back into his living room, the agents following, their eyes scanning the space, not as guests, but as a crime scene. He sat on the bottom step of his stairs and pulled on a pair of sneakers. He felt like he was moving through a dream, a bad one where every detail was painfully sharp. The pattern of the rug, the morning light slanting through the blinds, the quiet hum of the refrigerator. This was his home, and they were taking him from it. "Turn around, please. Place your hands behind your back." He complied. The cold metal of the handcuffs closed around his wrists with a precise final click. The sound was louder than the pounding on the door had been. It was a sound he had heard and made 100 times. It felt entirely different on his own skin. It was a bite of cold shame. They guided him out the door. He didn't look back. He walked, head up, through his own front yard. He saw a curtain twitch in the house across the street. He was paraded past his own trimmed hedges, past the garden hose coiled by the spigot, to a waiting, unmarked sedan. They placed a hand on his head as they put him in the back seat, a procedure he knew by heart. The door slammed shut, sealing him in. He was processed like any other arrest. They took his fingerprints, the ink rolling over his fingertips. He had taken prints from drug dealers, from terrorists, from corrupt politicians. Now his own prints were going into the system, linked to a case file with his name on it. They took his photograph, the mugshot. He stared at the camera, his face a blank mask. He refused to let them see the hurricane inside. They took his belt, his shoelaces, the contents of his pockets, a few dollars, his house key. He was given a set of dark blue, scratchy scrubs and a pair of rubber sandals. Then came the cell. It was a holding cell, meant for short stays, but it was a cell all the same. The door was solid steel with a small, thick window. It closed with a heavy, echoing clang that vibrated in his bones. He was alone. The walls were pale green, scuffed and marked. A hard bench was bolted to the wall. A stainless steel toilet sat in the corner, with no seat or lid. He sat on the bench. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant buzz of fluorescent lights and, once, the sound of someone shouting far away. He looked at his hands, now free of the cuffs, but marked by the memory of them. These were the hands that had held a rifle in defense of his country. The hands that had shaken the hand of the director. The hands that had taught his niece how to tie her shoes. Now they were the hands of inmate #78234. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. He had spent his entire career on one side of these walls. He had built cases to put people here. He had believed in the system, in its rules, in its ability to find the truth and separate right from wrong. Now he was a piece of data within that system, a problem to be processed. The very tools he had used, the warrants, the arrests, the protocols, were being used to break him. It was a perfect, devastating trap. He thought about the 2 officers. Were they on duty right now? Driving their patrol car, flashing their lights at someone else? Their lives were untouched. His was in ruins. They had pointed a gun, and he had filed a piece of paper. In return, they had pointed the entire justice system at him, and it was a far more powerful weapon. Hours passed. He didn't sleep. He just sat, thinking, cycling through anger, despair, and a cold, hard determination. They wanted him to feel powerless. They wanted him to crumble, to drop his complaint, to go away quietly. His lawyer came later that afternoon. They met in a small, concrete-walled attorney room. The lawyer's face was grim. "They're pushing for no bail," he said, "calling you a flight risk, a danger to the community given your knowledge of law enforcement procedures. It's nonsense, but it's scary nonsense to a judge who doesn't know you. What do we do?" The captain asked. His voice was hoarse from disuse. "We fight," the lawyer said simply. "We show them you have roots. We show them this case is garbage. But it's going to cost a lot." He mentioned a number for the bail bondsman, a sum that would clean out what was left of the captain's savings. The bail hearing was a blur of legal arguments. The prosecutor, a young man with a sharp suit, spoke about the seriousness of the charges and the public trust betrayed. The captain's lawyer fought back, pointing to a lifetime of service, to the complete lack of any evidence beyond a single sketchy statement. The judge, an older woman with tired eyes, listened to both sides. She set bail. It was high, punishingly high, but it was not no bail. It was a small victory, bought at a terrible price. He posted bail and walked out of the county jail as evening fell. The air smelled different, free, but it didn't feel that way. He was out, but he wasn't free. He was weighed down by the ankle monitor they had fastened to him, a constant, humiliating reminder that the system considered him a risk. He was a prisoner in his own home again. Now, with an electronic tether dot, he returned to a house that felt hollow. The silence was no longer just empty. It was accusing. Every room reminded him of what he had lost. He stood in his home office, looking at the framed photos on the wall, a graduation from the academy, a team picture from a big win. They felt like pictures of another man's life. He had very little money left. His salary was suspended. The legal bills were a mountain. He was a captain, a man used to command and respect, and now he was counting change to buy groceries, worrying about how to pay the next electricity bill. The fall was not just professional. It was total. They had taken his dignity, his liberty, his livelihood, and were now closing in on his last dollar. He sat at his kitchen table in the dark, the green light of the ankle monitor blinking rhythmically under his pants leg. He felt a profound isolation, deeper than anything he had ever known. But in the very center of that cold, dark feeling, a small, stubborn coal of anger still glowed. They had thrown everything at him. They had jailed him. They had bankrupted him. They had tried to break his spirit, but he was still here. And as long as he was still here, he could fight. The fight had just changed. It was no longer about a complaint. It was about survival. It was about proving that the truth could not be buried, even when the people shoveling the dirt were the ones who were supposed to protect it. The weight of the ankle monitor was a constant companion. It was a plastic and steel reminder of his new reality, a little green light blinking its judgment with every step he took around his own house. His world had shrunk to the radius permitted by its signal. He spent his days in a strange, quiet purgatory, watching his savings drain away to pay his lawyer and the bondsman. The fight felt like it was happening in slow motion, and he was losing simply by standing still. His lawyer, however, was a man who moved like a glacier slow, immense and unstoppable. He was not a flashy courtroom performer, but a former federal prosecutor who knew the machinery of justice from the inside. He understood that this case wasn't about a dramatic courtroom speech. It was about paperwork, precedent, and pressure. "They're betting on us folding," the lawyer told him during one of their meetings. "They're betting the weight of the system will crush you before we can even get to a trial. We need to change the weight." He began filing motions, each one a precise, surgical strike. He didn't just defend his client. He went on the offensive. He subpoenaed the personnel files of the two police officers. He demanded the complete, unedited body camera footage from the traffic stop, not just the clipped version Internal Affairs had seen. He subpoenaed the phone records and the plea deal documents of the confidential informant who had accused the captain of bribery. The local police department and the prosecutor's office fought back hard. They filed objections, claimed the requests were a fishing expedition, argued that the officers' past histories were irrelevant. It was a legal tug-of-war, happening in quiet courtrooms and through stacks of legal briefs. For the captain, it was just more waiting, more anxiety, more blinking green lights in the dark. Then a crack appeared. It came from an unexpected direction. A young, ambitious prosecutor from the Federal Public Integrity Section, a unit that investigated corruption among government officials, had been quietly reviewing the case. Something about it didn't sit right with her. The timing, the thinness of the evidence. She reached out to the captain's lawyer, not to help the defense, but to understand. She was from a different office, a different chain of command, and she had no loyalty to the local player's dot at the same time. The captain's lawyer brought in a specialist, a renowned civil rights attorney, a woman whose entire career was built on taking on powerful institutions. She saw the case not just as a defense against false charges, but as an offense against a profound injustice. They didn't just try to jail you, she said, her voice calm and certain. They tried to erase your truth. We're going to help you write it back in. The alliance was formidable. The civil rights attorney took over the fight against the police department and the original bogus charges. The federal prosecutor from Public Integrity began her own quiet probe into the origins of the informant's accusation. The captain's original lawyer managed the criminal defense. For the first time since the gun was pointed at him, the captain was not standing alone. He had a team. The breakthrough happened in a stuffy conference room during a pre-trial hearing for the bribery case. The civil rights attorney was cross-examining the lead detective from Internal Affairs about the traffic stop. She was methodical, polite, and relentless. Detective, you stated that the officer's use of force was justified based on the driver's furtive movements, correct? That is correct. And these movements were described as him reaching toward the center console? Yes. Would reaching for an FBI badge and credential case, which he had informed the officers was his intent, be considered a furtive movement? The detective shifted in his seat. It depends on the context and the officer's perception. Of course, she said smoothly. She then entered into evidence the captain's own meticulously written notes from that night, time-stamped just hours after the event. They described his deliberate actions. She contrasted it with the officer's report, written days later. Then she played the audio from the body camera. The captain's voice, steady and clear. Asterisk, my credentials. I am an FBI captain. The officer's barked command. Asterisk, don't move. The chilling sound of the gun being drawn from its holster. A distinct, metallic shick-click that was unmistakable on the recording. The room was silent. The audio didn't lie. It captured the fear, the aggression, and the captain's calm attempts to de-escalate. The furtive movements were the sounds of a man trying to show his badge, but the attorney wasn't done. She then presented the personnel files she had finally pried loose. The officer who had drawn his gun had 3 prior sustained complaints for excessive force, all settled internally. The other officer had been the subject of 2 separate racial profiling lawsuits, both settled out of court by the city. A pattern emerged, not of a one-time mistake, but of a history of aggression that the department had repeatedly ignored. The judge overseeing the criminal bribery case saw all of this. More importantly, the federal prosecutor from Public Integrity saw it. Her own investigation had uncovered the informant's deal. A pending drug possession charge with a mandatory minimum sentence had vanished 2 days after he signed the statement accusing the FBI captain. The prosecutor who dropped that charge was golf buddies with the brother of one of the accused police officers. It was a house of cards, and the wind had finally started to blow. The collapse happened quickly. Faced with the evidence of perjury and evidence tampering, the informant recanted his entire story. He admitted he was pressured to lie. The federal prosecutor, armed with this and the evidence of the officers' histories, went to the judge in the criminal case. She argued that the charges were not just weak, but were the product of a malicious conspiracy to obstruct justice and deprive a man of his civil rights. The judge agreed. In a terse, powerful order, she dismissed the bribery charges with prejudice, meaning they could never be brought again. She used words like egregious misconduct and a stain on the justice system. The ankle monitor was removed that afternoon. The feeling of the cold steel band coming off was like taking his first full breath in months. But it wasn't over. Vindication was not the same as justice. The captain, now with his name cleared and his FBI credentials restored, stood beside his civil rights attorney as she announced a federal lawsuit against the police department, the two officers, and the city. This time, he wasn't asking for an internal review. He was demanding accountability in the one language institutions understood. Consequence. The lawsuit was brutal in its detail. It laid out the entire story, from the traffic stop to the orchestrated plot to jail him. It cited the officers' histories, the hidden body cam audio, the coerced informant. The city, facing a public relations nightmare and the prospect of a massive jury verdict, chose to settle. The financial settlement was significant, but the non-negotiable demands were what mattered most to the captain. The two officers were to be terminated immediately. Their certifications were to be revoked, preventing them from being cops anywhere else. The department was required to implement a new, independent review process for use of force and bias complaints. With public reporting, the day the settlement was announced, the captain put on his suit and returned to the FBI office. He walked through the doors, his badge back on his hip. The silence was different this time. It was a respectful, almost awed quiet. Colleagues didn't just nod. Some stopped and shook his hand. They had seen the news. They knew what he had survived. He was given his old job back, but he was a different man. The easy trust he had in the system was gone, replaced by a harder, clearer understanding of how fragile justice could be. He had learned that the badge could be a shield, but it could also be a target. He had seen how quickly a life built on service could be torn down by a lie and a vested interest. He returned to work, but he also began to speak quietly to training classes of new agents. He didn't talk about tactics or law. He talked about integrity, about the importance of speaking up even when it's hard, about understanding that the power they held could be misused in ways they couldn't imagine. He became a living lesson, not in corruption, but in resilience. He still lived on the same street. He still drove home at night. Sometimes, when he passed that spot on the shoulder, a cold finger would trace its way down his spine. The memory of the gun was a scar he would always carry. But the shame was gone. It had been replaced by a hard-won truth, a truth that had almost been buried but had refused to stay silent. He had walked into the darkness of the system and had managed somehow to walk back out. And he knew, for every person who didn't have his resources or his team, that darkness could be a permanent cell. That knowledge, more than anything, was what he carried with him now. It was a weight, but it was his to bear.